Episode 2. This episode is part of the Faith in the Nexus Exploring Children's Spirituality series, and it looks at how we can help children's spirituality to flourish. We reflect on the different ways adults interpret their role and consider the value of exploring alongside the child, shoulder to shoulder.
Hello, I'm Dr. Anne Casson from the National Institute for Christian Education Research at Canterbury Christ Church University. We're talking today about a research report that came out called Faith in the Nexus, which looked at how church primary schools facilitate opportunities for children to explore faith in the home. We looked at some of the key findings that came out were children talking about faith, initiating talk, children seeking reflection space, and the idea of a sense of belonging to some sort of a Christian community. What we want to move on to talk about today is some of this in greater depth. I'd like to introduce the guests that we have today. So, Nick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Nick Taunt. I was for 18 years head teacher of a secondary church school. And I've always been interested in how children grow in faith. Now I'm working as an educational consultant.
And Kieran.
And I'm Kieran O'Brien. I'm the director of Ministory, and we're a storytelling agency, and most of my work is around helping clients to tell their story, but also I have a strong interaction with spirituality.
I think we finished last time looking at, exploring what we meant by spirituality and what spirituality was about. We want to explore a little bit today about how we can go forward, how we can encourage children's spirituality to flourish. And one of the things we mentioned and want to go into more depth is the idea of shoulder to shoulder approach. That how do we work with children? How do we work alongside children? Kieran, would you like to, give us some ideas of what we mean by shoulder to shoulder?
Yeah, this is a really key concept in storytelling. So when you tell a story, something magical happens. Is that no longer are you face to face with the person you're speaking to, you're telling the story shoulder to shoulder. So the dynamics of the conversation change. No longer are you looking towards each other, you're looking towards something else, something beyond. And shoulder to shoulder communication is really important in today's age, because when we look at the success of social media, how children and young people interact with it, the best marketing campaigns, they all adopt a shoulder to shoulder approach. So your Marks and Spencers will no longer sell you how good they are at making clothes or pants or their best products. They'll tell a story around Christmas, something around something joyful, and that's a shoulder-to-shoulder approach where you're no longer trying to convince people that come to my shop, come to have my services, buy my products. Organizations, businesses are now telling stories, and the importance of that is that you're warming people up at the heart level to relate, to engage with them, so that you want to walk alongside them. And it's a really interesting technique. And when I look at kind of a lot of spirituality techniques, they all use a shoulder-to-shoulder approach. If you think about Jesus, very rarely quotes dogma or anything else. He tells stories, and the power of those stories in helping us to understand who God is, the nature of God. And those stories have huge depth, which we keep returning to every Sunday. We keep reading stories again and again because they have so many layers to them. So that when we tell stories, we lead people into a different way of thinking. So when it comes to working with children, young people, it's storytelling and shoulder-to-shoulder approach, I really, really believe is so important that we return to this way of interacting with people, rather than, which we'll look at, I guess, in a few minutes, is that face-to-face, I have the answers, this is what I believe, and I want you to believe. And if we look at the decline in religious attendance or engagement with children, young people, we have to question whether this approach is working and whether we do need a new approach. And I think that's what we're trying to get to here in Faith in the Nexus.
And it's often the way children connect. Nick, were you gonna,
Yes, just from what you're saying, Kieran, I'm thinking of sitting down with some of my very young grandchildren with picture books, and I'm reading the story, but they're pointing out stuff. They're pointing out things in the pictures, which, and it makes me think of the way in which with Jesus's stories, the disciples often ask him afterwards. They're picking out bits. Yes, but what about this? What does that mean? You know, what was the sower doing, or what were the different types of ground, and why is that? And that kind of interaction just grows out of both looking at the same thing together.
Yeah, another element of the shoulder to shoulder, which moves outside storytelling, and this is the hardest bit, is if you want to teach your children how to pray, you pray, you do it, and sitting next to you shoulder to shoulder, they learn, rather than, well, here's a book on how to pray, and you do this, and then you sit back and do nothing. So it's the way you like. If I think about the way I learnt my faith, was always shoulder to shoulder. We went to church. We didn't sit down and read through kind of this is the fundamentals of our belief. We believe this and X, Y, and Z. We just experienced it. So the other part of shoulder to shoulder is not just storytelling, is doing the actual work, walking alongside your children, which is obviously a lot more challenging. It's much easier to give a child a book and tell them how to do it, or websites or an app, than to sit down and do the heavy work alongside them.
I think many people find it really challenging to do this shoulder to shoulder and walking alongside, and they adopt quite different approaches. When we were producing the animation, we thought through about the many different approaches that people adopt, which are great value, but also, prove challenging in today's, one of the first examples we looked at is, maybe the idea of somebody from an older generation who says, well, you just need to believe. Now, that's got great value. Yeah. Kieran, were you picking? Yeah.
Yeah, and it was really interesting when we first started this project. We kind of sat down and we looked at the reports, and we had to really think through how do we tell this as a story, and we spent a long time kind of getting to the final story at the end. And out of that, I think what was clear, we need to come out with archetypes. And the archetypes we came out with, 4 archetypes, all representing different ways of working with children, young people. And each archetype we recognize has an innate value. They're important. We need these archetypes. But the challenge, I think, was when we looked at the report, it's each archetype on its own wasn't always connecting. And if you take the first archetype, which I think in the animation we illustrated it more or less like a grandmother, someone of the older generation. And when I think about it, I think about my kind of a Catholic upbringing. It's my mum, it's some grandparents, and we had pretty much a very, clear faith. We believe this. This is the Irish Catholic kind of no, there's no black and white. No, sorry, it's no grey area. It's only black and white. This is what it is. And if you don't understand it, just believe, because that's what faith is. And and that's great. So if we anytime we have a challenging concept to think about, if something doesn't connect, we just need to overcome it and say, I just believe, and then it all goes away. But I think, and I don't know what your thoughts are. What were the problems with this archetype in your research? Why was this archetype no longer working?
I think one of the things that came across from children who encountered people who had tried to help them, were kind, and trying to explain, well, this is the approach. If you just believe, is the questions they came up with again was, but why? Children are full of why questions, and they're very not accepting of, well, just believe just because I say so, and they wanted to know something deeper, something a little bit more. And they wanted to, rather than just, because sometimes that approach to children seem to just shut it down. Like, well, I'm not, I can't answer your questions. Just believe, whereas children want to explore a little bit further. Nick, were you? Yeah.
Well, we admire our grandparents, don't we? They've
Yes.
been through a lot. They've been through all these experiences, and they seem to us as young children, they seem to us as very solid and reliable people. But it's perhaps actually that great span of experiences that they've had, our grandparents have had, that actually is a bit of a barrier for us when it comes to asking questions about why, because these are questions which are naturally part of who we are as people anyway. As adults, we ask those questions, and while we perhaps don't always have concrete and absolute answers, we think of how we experience things and how experience teaches us solutions that at least we're comfortable with. That it's through experience that we become comfortable with our sense of who we are, and we can't. We've got to help young children to ask those questions of their own experience, more limited as clearly more older people's experiences. But that's perhaps why the only believe answer, it actually comes from all the experiences that our grandparents have had, but perhaps that's why it's not quite satisfying to younger children, because they've not had those experiences yet to find out the whys and wherefores.
And from a kind of a genuine interest, Nick, if I can ask you a question, is that you could argue that this approach has worked in the past. It works really well. People were given faith, they were passed on the faith, and they didn't critically think it through. They just accepted it. It was just a given. And do you think, from an educational perspective, Nick, that children are now brought up to kind of do kind of critical thinking, to question why more? And is that the reason why this approach doesn't work, or do you think there's another reason in today's world that it's shifted slightly?
I think there are two answers. One is just the larger answer about culture, that our society is less accepting of straight authority, and the individual is seen as much more important. And in fact, the old certainties that perhaps our grandparents grew up in with are no longer quite so sure and certain. And within school itself, rather than disparaging the old certainties, there's been far greater emphasis on helping children learn. It's not the content which is the most important thing, it's the actual process of learning that is most important in education today, because we see ourselves as carrying on learning long after we've left school. And if we've only learnt from school the stuff, that stuff is soon going to become out of date. And what lasts is knowing how to learn effectively to meet new challenges. And that's what education's looking at most of all.
And I think that's what came out in the report, talking to the children when they talked about RE in the primary schools, in the church primary schools. They were talking about the questions. They just love the questions. Often lessons finished with an I wonder question, and they'd start next week with the same question. Or they would just be looking at big questions, which, you know, the teacher would be quite open with, have no answers, no definite answers, and it's just exploring. And that approach, often when they try and translate into that home environment, or to, you know, with somebody who has a I believe, just believe approach, sort of comes into conflict, I think. And it's just, well, I don't just believe, I want to know why. Even though, as we get on, you know, discuss a bit further, you know, there's no right answers. There's no, you know, there's no answer, golden answer out there to find, but it's just that exploration. Nick?
And feeling comfortable with those why questions, which don't have a straightforward up and down answer is also perhaps new in people's experience, and perhaps less new in the experience of ourselves when we were growing up. Mm-hmm. The sense that actually it's absolutely all right to be asking questions for which there are no answers, and just to struggle towards a position that we feel comfortable with.
But it's challenging, isn't it? Because it's living with uncertainty. Whereas if you can say, you just believe, just have faith, it'll be all right. Yeah, that's it gives you some level of certainty, security, which a young child with their questions is perhaps challenging. Yeah.
And from a storytelling perspective, I'm always quite intrigued that in the past, a lot of people, generations grew up what I would call a single story universe. There was little interaction with other cultures, there was little interaction with other faiths, different worldviews, belief systems. So everyone, you can argue, shared a very similar worldview, perspective, and kind of faith tradition. And I think I grew up on the margins of this, where everyone around me was Christian or Catholic. So I went to church, and it was odd having these other Christians who didn't go to Catholic church. I wasn't quite sure. They were just a little bit different. But my interaction with other world religions, worldviews was almost zero, zilch. I think children, young people growing up in today's world, that's different. We have to grow up in this multi-story universe. So therefore, do you grow up thinking, well, is my story more important? Is my story right? Is how do we help children to grow up in this much more complex, nuanced world where this single universe, story universe no longer exists. So the stresses and strains that I think children are facing in their spiritual developments cannot be discounted or just be overlooked by saying, well, I did it this way back in the 1950s, it worked for me, so why doesn't it work for you? Is children and young people are growing up in a really different world and complex world, and how do they make sense of that?
I wonder though whether the grandparents that we're talking about from the animation, actually it's the stories that they tell. You will have to find out for yourself, but for me, here's my story. Here's how I came to faith, or here's how I think Jesus helped me in this particular time. Yeah. I think really stories that we can support our youngest people. Yeah. Sorry, Anne.
I was going to say, I think that's a really important approach, that actually from the wealth of experience and the wealth of experience of faith, that rather than just saying, well, just believe, you share your stories of faith. I think that really is, children find that fascinating and are happy to explore with you in that way. And that's, we're going back to shoulder to shoulder, being alongside, tell your stories. That is one way that you can engage with young people. And a lot of the older generations are finding this when they're working in multi-generational, intergenerational work within church. It's sharing the stories, and young people are fascinated by the stories, of the older generation. But I think I want to pick up something, Kieran was saying about, answers and that. One of the other archetypes we looked at was somebody who wanted to give the right answers, and that was often in the report. Parents wanted to give the right answers, and they thought there was somebody out there with the right answers. And in the modern age, children are quite used to, well, you Google and you've got the answer. And I think that's quite a challenging one, because people do want answers, and somebody who says, well, I've got the answers, I've got the book, or I know where you find this answer. It's positive in that it gives you comfort. It's like there's somebody out there. I don't know the answer, but it might be the teacher in the school, or it might be the vicar. They know the answer. Somebody knows the answer. Kieran.
And it's a really, really big question. Is when we're talking about spirituality, truth, we talk about answer. So what is the truth? What's the answer to the question? And this is really challenging, because if you give an answer, it's not what you're looking for. If I can explain that a bit more, I think it's a lot of people from previous generations, particularly Catholics, they had the catechism. So what's the answer to all life's problems? Well, you can find it on page 4, paragraph 3. Who am I? Who is God? All the answers were given in bullet points. And if you repeat these in a rote fashion, you have the faith and you believe them. If you conceptualize them, you believe them. But life's not quite like that. It would be great if it was, where you can have a book with all the answers in it. Is that when we come into deep truths, it's trying to find the answers. It's like layers of meaning. That it's the answer to big questions. I think it's some of the questions that came in the report around, I think around death. Well, does God exist? Who is God? These are big questions, and you can say, who is God? Well, God created you. God is a creator. Well, that's an answer. That's helpful. What does that mean? In your prayer life, what does that mean in everyday kind of experience? What does that mean to the world we live in? So those answers, a book answer can help in as far as it goes, but it cannot give you the ultimate answers to the questions you're asking. So when we're looking at spirituality, we are looking at ultimate answers, something that goes much deeper. I'm not sure if that's helped in any way or muddied the waters.
It is helpful, and it's very attractive. It's very attractive to be given a straight answer that you can simply not just accept but believe in. The problem comes as children grow up, indeed as we grow up, when we come across experiences that seem to challenge that. We're asking about what happens when we die, and we're told, well, we'll go to heaven, and then someone close to us dies, and well, what does that actually mean, and where is heaven, and what is it, and suddenly we're into moving from an answer that was very clear and succinct and definite into an area which is actually very unclear. Is heaven actually not a place but a relationship with God? Or yes, is heaven a person? Are you really saying that our bodies will be resurrected, and so on? And all these questions, unless they are explored, begin to chip away at that solid foundation of the clear and definite answer. And it's that progression from perhaps the usefully clear and definite answers to start off with. It's the progression from there to a point where you can understand it in a much more profound and I was going to say sophisticated. I don't mean that, but in a way which we can accept. That's the process which I think is most challenging to children as they grow up.
I think that's really important. I remembered a child that I was interviewing, and they were talking about their rabbit had died. And you can see, they wanted to know why, obviously, the rabbit had died. And you think, well, somebody could give them a straight answer and explain, length of rabbit lives, etc. But then they went on to describe, and this is where I think the shoulder-to-shoulder exploring helped, how they'd made a rabbit grave in their garden, and they'd used all the symbols from their classroom reflection space to put into this grave, and created a little grave area for this rabbit. And you think that was a wonderful opportunity to explore with the child, their big questions about death, which is not obviously, what just my rabbit's died, what it's about, but it's, it opens up that bigger question, what is death? And often we ignore that, the children's little question about, a pet's died, which to them is devastating, is the opportunity for that bigger question. They start thinking about the bigger questions of death, and it cannot just be, dismissed, well, we can explain why your guinea pig, your hamster has died. It's that opportunity that it opens up, Kieran. I think it's really important there.
Yeah, so it's I think what came out in the report was all these creates an opportunity, a wonderful opportunity to step into the child's world, stand shoulder to shoulder with them, and explore the big questions in a meaningful way. But with it's back to that archetype. The archetype that we're looking at was someone who believes that if you have a question, it's back to your 1 + 1 = 2 is a kind of answer, and which is really helpful because 1 + 1 does equal 2. And if we come back with an alternative answer, we're not going to get very far. But when it comes to spirituality, of course, 1 + 1 is not a good way of thinking these things through. Why did the rabbit die? Well, rabbits die. They don't live that long. So it's that's not the question they're asking. So it's a deeper question. What is death? What does that mean? So what does it mean to be a person that is eventually going to die? And will I die? Will my friends, my family die? These are really, really tough questions that a child will have to explore at some point. And questions around the hardest ones, death obviously is really difficult, but also suffering. Why does God allow suffering? Like, answers on a postcard, please, because that is, we call it a mystery, the mystery of suffering. Because the more we try to understand it, the deeper we go into finding more meaningful kind of what does that really mean, and how could a loving God create a world where suffering exists? Doesn't God love us enough, or does God not have the power to stop suffering? Are we being punished? These are really, really important questions, and if they're left unanswered, we will kind of feel them in ourselves, not very well, I would add. That's yes. Why we need people around us to help us, guide us through those really, really tough questions.
And part of the answering is actually saying we don't quite know. Mm-hmm. And another part of it is saying, well, what does Jesus say about this, or what stories are there? Perhaps the story of Lazarus. What is the fact that Jesus wept when he came across Lazarus's grave? What does that say about what Jesus felt about death? What can we be more certain about? But also, what can we allowably be uncertain about? And acknowledging what we don't know and what we can't say for certain is, I think, as important as saying what we can say for certain.
And I think that's really important, Nick, that being uncertain. And you can see why many of the parents I spoke to wanted there to be someone out there, whether it was the teacher in the church school or whether it was the vicar, who had the answer, because they didn't have the answer. They were uncertain about all these questions, these questions of death or suffering. But the idea that, well, if I just get them to ask the teacher, or if I just, wait till we see the vicar and we can ask the vicar because he will know, that sense of, it's not offloading responsibility, but that sense of security that, well, I don't know that, but I know, there's surely somebody who does know it. And it goes back to the idea that many non-churchgoers have, that the people within the congregation, people who cross the threshold of the church door, they know the answers. That's why they're in there. They've got it sorted. They've got no doubts. They know the answers.
Curiously, that makes it all the more difficult, I think, for parents. And I think that's our third archetype. Is it it makes it the more difficult for parents to talk at home, because they feel that there are people out there who are the experts. Mm-hmm. And those people who are meant to be the experts talk with great authority and apparent expertise, which is not always very helpful. And parents feel all the less empowered to speak at home when these questions arise.
Yeah, it's the idea of de-skilling people, isn't it? To say, well, actually, you need to have this qualification to be able to talk about this. And I think this is one of the archetypes that came out so clearly in the report. Often I'd ask pupils about what happened in school, and they'd tell me about their RE, their collective worship, and what they talked about. And then, I'd just say, well, what about home? And often you'd get children say, no, never talk about this at home. Wouldn't talk about this at home. And the same with parents. They'd say, oh, but they do it really good in school. They do it really good in school, but no, we wouldn't talk. And we explored in some depth, Kieran, didn't we? Why were these parents silent? Why was this radio silence in the home about any matters of faith?
Yeah, so the third archetype, it took us a while to come to this one because it's a lot of these archetypes kind of overlap in many ways. But the third one we felt was when asked a question by the child, they'll just shrug, or I don't know. So it's there has to be someone else. There's someone else who knows the answer to that. So they'll point either to the book. There must be like an answer, or let's Google the answer to this question. No, why is there suffering? Let's find out the Google answer to that. So it's or they just have a fear of not wanting to talk about these things. And I think the word you came out with, it's a strong word. So that people feel embarrassed to talk about spiritual matters. After all, it's all they might have done spirituality or church stuff when they were younger, but they no longer do this, so they feel a bit kind of awkward speaking about these issues. So there was a kind of that reluctance to even go there, and how do I get out of this situation as quick as I can? Point them in the different direction of someone who has an answer or can deal with that. And I think in some of the conversation we spoke about the parents usually say, "Oh, speak to your grandparents," because the grandparent would have that, pretty much. This is what it is. This is what we believe, and we're back to state the first archetype. This is what we believe. You have to have faith to overcome it. So you're sending the child on this kind of like circular journey, trying to find answers to the deep questions. And it's really difficult because as a parent, you want to have the answers. You want to be able to accompany a child and be there for them. And I can remember a while ago, I was on the tube, and and there was, I think she must have been about 7 years old, this young girl, and the father was sitting next to her reading the newspaper. On the front of the newspaper, there was an attack. I think it was a murder, and and the girl said, Did that person die? And the father said, yeah, she did. Did a bad person kill her? Yes. And then she said, but you said when we watch the news, it's not all real. And he said, well, actually, it is all real. That's what life's like. And then he just turns the paper and kind of carries on reading. And I saw the girl kind of look down at her feet and say, but I don't want it to be real. And it just felt in that moment there, her world changed from the safe world she'd grown up with her parents, keeping her safe through storytelling and saying, all the evil things you see out there, all the bad things, they're not really real. It's all just make believe. And breaking through to this real world actually is all real. There's some really horrible people out there. Nasty things happen, suffering happens. And seeing the parents not being able to handle that, I felt really sad. That's a really important moment, a stage for a child to develop, to move from the old world of safety. The world is fine. And when in kind of children's psychology, especially in primary schools, you teach children that the world is wonderful, it's beautiful. God created a beautiful world. But then when we get older, we wake up to the fact that, okay, it's a beautiful world, but parts of it aren't so great, and suffering does exist. So as a parent, it's really important, how do we help children transition to that rather than just announcing it on the tube on the way somewhere and then carry on reading newspaper and just pretend it didn't happen. It's really hard because that's a big shift in your kind of spiritual conscience, trying to move from the old world to the new world. And as parents, how can we help children transition from the old to the new? It's really, really challenging.
To be kind to the parent, one might make the point that the tube might not have been the best place to engage in that conversation. But I think your point is absolutely right, isn't it? That it is a very confusing question. Do bad people do these things, and why do they do them? Because we just don't know. And to be able to say that we don't know in a way that a 7-year-old girl will understand, but still keep faith and trust in her parent, who, when the girl was younger, suggested that actually everything was nice and fine. That's a challenge.
I think it's also a challenge if we say we don't talk about these things at home, as like a lot of parents would do, because of through embarrassment or whatever, is that the child's going to fill in their own explanations. And it's not like, well, if we don't talk about it, they just believe what they believe at school, or they just do this. They think, well, that's not important then. They come to their own conclusions if it's not talked about. Or, my parents don't think that's important. My dad doesn't think that's important. So, why would I talk about it? And you find that, young children are quite happy to talk about it. But suddenly, when you talk to, children who are 10 and 11, the top age of primary school, they think, well, that's not something we talk about. That you little kids talk about that, because I know, at home we don't talk about that. And it's given a message, a much deeper message, when there is that silence at home that perhaps parents don't mean to give at all.
That's a really hard one, isn't it? Because I think we spoke about before that when we talk about spirituality, we have almost these empty buckets that need to be filled. Who am I?
Yeah.
Where do I belong? What is life about? Is the world a safe place, or does it have meaning and purpose? And if we don't, if we're not helping children to kind of answer those big questions, they'll go away and find their own answers, and then those own answers might not be very useful for later life. So when we talk about building strong foundations for children to flourish, we need to take really seriously the question around how do we help children to answer those big questions. And as a parent, if you're silent, we just feel a bit awkward, or I'd rather not talk about this. So we're doing a great disservice there, because we all have something to offer, because we've all asked those questions, and we'll all struggle with them. And it doesn't mean that we have the right answers, because the answers to the big questions, are kind of you find the answers through experience. It's who am I? It's not something you find in a book. It's something that you have to really dig deep within yourself and experience in relation to others, and in faith and prayer as well. So as a parent, is how do we take more seriously the importance of spiritual development of our children, and not see it as, it's fine, it's one of those kind of unimportant things that they'll find out at school, or ask the priest, ask the vicar, someone else will have the answer, or the youth worker, someone can do this better than I can. Actually, we all have a gift to offer our children when we're willing to kind of sit shoulder to shoulder and explore those questions with them.
Nick.
And we're in a as parents, we have a unique opportunity to explore these things. Unique in the sense that teachers or ministers or grandparents don't have, and that's the relationship that we have with our children. And it's a relationship in which I think you used the word, Kieran, safe earlier on, which is we offer our children and we bring them up in a safe place, and it's a safe place to explore things that children might not want to explore elsewhere. It's safe because whatever the answer is, we know our parents still love us and we still trust them. Now, clearly there are some families where tragically there isn't that strength of love and trust, and that is tragic because that has such an impact on children. But in most families there is that love which is unconditional and which is non-judgmental, so that we can as children we can ask those questions knowing that we're loved, even if we've asked them, even when we know that they, or we think they may be stupid questions, or we think they may even be rude questions. We know our parents will still love us even when we've asked those questions which we're afraid of. And I think if we talked earlier about parents being embarrassed and also parents not knowing the right answers. What parents have is that real sense of love that no other individual has in a young child's life.
And I think that's really important. And one of the things, we've talked a lot about parents here, but actually a lot of teachers, there is radio silence. A lot of teachers are really embarrassed to engage, in difficult questions. When you're teaching a lesson and the child suddenly throws up, a challenging question, it's very easy to move on or to feel, well, I'm not really sure how I'd answer that. And even, clergy, often they don't feel confident engaging with young children's questions because they can go anywhere. A young child will ask a question about anything. And maybe it's not just parents we need to think about, well, how do professionals, how do teachers, how do the clergy who are coming into schools or other adults coming to school, how do they engage with children's questions without shutting it down? And I think, maybe widen it out. It's not just parents who, feel really embarrassed or lack confidence in, tackling these questions, which maybe leads us on to like the fourth, archetype that we came up with. And this is quite a different one in a way. It sort of overlaps with many, but the idea that many parents had, and many of the parents in the report sort of said, well, what I'd say, when my child asks a question like that, I turn it around and I say, well, what do you think? Because I don't want to influence them. Or I say, they must make their own minds up. It's not me. It's not up to me to decide for them. And this would be talking about quite young children, 5-6-year-olds, that, they turn the question around and say, well, it's up to you. What do you think? This is quite a challenging one because it seems quite positive, like, engaging with the child. They talk with the child, about this, but ultimately it's up to you. Kieran, do you want to?
Yeah, so I think when we spoke about this archetype, we were trying to, if I can remember the conversation right, which was a while ago, the parent one, the silence one was someone who didn't want to talk about these things. But then we had other people who were quite happy to sit down and talk about faith, spirituality. But there's a fear or there's an underlying kind of reluctance to kind of say it's this or that, to guide them. Say, actually, it's up to you. Do you believe in God? Well, do you? Well, it's up to you. Well, if you're 7 years old, that's a big question. So how can you answer that question as a 7-year-old? So it's, even though the adults might believe in God or have faith, they're quite, it's supportive if the child says, "Oh, actually, I don't believe in God." Well, that's up to you. So it's actually that's not very helpful, really. And I guess some of the other questions is when children were asking the big questions, how do we make sense of them? Well, it's up to you. You find the answer. What do you think the answer is? So it goes on the other extreme of the first archetype, which is the answer is this. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have, the answer is what you want the answer to be. And that's not really helpful either, as we know, because how can children answer the big questions by themselves? How can you throw them into, leave them alone in their spiritual wandering? I think in the animation we had the child looking at the signpost, kind of looking left and right and shrugging, which way do I go? And then if there's no one there to help them or guide them, say, actually, there is a way through. I can't give you all the answers, but I can walk alongside you. There's again, so reluctance to walk alongside children. It's almost like, it's a bit strong to say a get out clause. Maybe that's probably too strong, but it's a fear that, we can't tell children what to think or believe. They have to find their own way. And there's elements of that. We do all need to discover our own faith in some way, but we do need people to guide us. We do need someone to show us better ways of moving forward with these big questions.
That's about respect, I think, is it? So you're in the animation, the person saying, "Well, just what do you think?" is feeling that, yes, I don't want to impose. I don't want to impose on you what I believe or what I think. You've got to decide. But that, as you're suggesting, that clearly doesn't work. It's, an adult doesn't say, "Well, you decide when to cross the road."
Mm.
I can see a bus coming, but but it's up to you to decide. And clearly, no adult would do that. They would obviously they would say, "Stop." We'll go across together. But actually, negotiating that difficult road is something that you do together. Do you think we can go now? Is only half of the answer. What do you think? It also has to be, well, this is what I think. Yeah, I think you're right. Let's walk across now. Or no, let's not, because a bus is coming and we'll get knocked over if we do. So it goes back to shoulder, doesn't it? We're actually discussing this together. And by asking someone just what they think is not avoiding imposing. It's actually a greater demonstration of respect is to ask what a child thinks. And for the child to ask, well, what do you think, Auntie?
Yeah.
And for the aunt to reply in a way, you can speak in a way which isn't imposing.
Mm.
Well, I believe this, and this is why I do.
Yeah. One of the mums I interviewed spoke of this quite eloquently, and she talked about these, the questions the children came home with, and speaking to the child, she said, "What do you think?" But then she followed it up because she would say to them, "But I've never thought about that." And then they'd have a question and think this through together. Because often a lot of the questions the children are bringing home from the RE that they're doing in schools today, are not anything like the RE their parents did. And some of these questions are really challenging. And if the parents can sit down with a child and say, "I've not thought about that. Let's think about it together." Or, "What do you think?" "Oh, well, this is what I think." That you get that sort of the beginnings of that shoulder to shoulder, that alongside discussions.
And that creates that sense of just of openness. In the same way as you're talking with your child, or your child's talking with with their parent about what's gone on in school today, in the playground, in the lesson. So there's a discussion about faith, because the child is confident that the person they're talking to is not going to jump in and contradict them or disagree, but we'll share.
So when it comes to it's the end of the animation, we had those 4 archetypes. So first of all, we gave them names. So you don't hear the names in the animation, because they're archetypes. But the first one we described as the grandmother, who had this is what we believe, and faith will overcome all problems. Then the second one, which we described as the teacher, the kind of dogmatic, here's the answer. And then the third one, the silent one, which we said is the parents, but can also be teachers. And then the fourth one, the open-minded person, or we describe as the auntie, who's saying, "No, it's up to you. You find your own way." And then what was so nice about in the animation is the role each one of these contributes to the child is really important, but it's when we put the child at the center. So moving away from an expert-centric world where you have all these different voices who all have the right answer in their own ways, to a child-centric approach where the child is at the center and the 4 archetypes stand alongside the child, journeying with them and asking those questions, which Nick said, how do we find the answers here? What do we mean by this? I think this, but let's find a way through. And in that kind of journey, and we create that safe space for a child's spirituality to flourish. And the difficult challenges is not about having the answers, because having the answer can actually close down the conversation. Oh, this is what we believe. Close the book. Let's not talk about it anymore. Well, how do you grow in your spiritual developments in faith and love and everything else if you close a book because you have the answer? Is actually you enter into the question alongside these 4 archetypes, and I guess that's what we're trying to do in that story in the Faith in the Nexus, is move away from that parent-centric world to a child-centric world, and saying actually how do we work alongside each other in a dynamic and creative way to help children grow in their spiritual development, but creating a safe space for that to happen.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognise that, that child-centric approach, that, the children are not passive recipients of each of these archetypes' points of view. They're engaging, they're thinking and working alongside. And it made me think of, how does a child, engage in all the different spheres of their life? Like, if in school they're one person engaging in one way, at home another, or in church another, where are the people they're exploring alongside? Where are they finding these individuals that they can explore alongside? Nick, you?
Yes, I think the in the animation, the child in the center of those 4 archetypes is really encouraging for all of us, for parents and grandparents and teachers, and the auntie who says, well, what do you think? Because actually a child needs all of those, those 4 things. And I think each one, if you like, each one of those archetypes are in a special position, but they're not fixed. And there will be times when, as a parent, you can be saying, well, let's see what Jesus said about this, and perhaps present that in quite a strong way. This is what Jesus says. So that then leads on to another question: what does what does that mean that we should perhaps be doing? Do you think? Or this is what we might do. The other thing is that as parents, there are opportunities for creating. I hesitate to use the word liturgy, but just as in church, there are patterns of worship that we call liturgy, and with and parents can do similar things. And I think you found, Anne, that there were parents who were lighting candles on special occasions, not just birthdays, or having some people of faith have a special corner in the house where they, which is a special place for worship, or outside, and it might be worth just exploring some of those too.
And I think that's really important. That goes back to our storytelling together, that, families creating these stories together. And it might be simply, some families started saying the school prayer at the end of the day. The child wanted to say the prayer at the end of the day, and then the whole family would do that, and that becomes a part of the ritual. Or it might be, children brought home ideas about, reflection spaces, which are in, most church primary schools have this corner in the classroom or outside, which is a special space. And children, adopted this idea and adopted it into the home. For some, it was a private area. They just kept it in their bedroom and it was theirs. But some of the families could engage with this as well, that we could have a space or a time, in the garden where we reflect together, when, we can make something and think together about spiritual things. And it's just those sort of, it's everyday religion. It's just like little bits and pieces that the family makes together. It's nothing elaborate. It's nothing sort of, thought through, well, we've got this package, you can take this home and do this. It's something that the family comes to together, and it might be just simple prayers at certain times. It might be making space, certain spaces, or having times when they remember things together and can talk through things together. And that becomes something that becomes really important, that can be explored together, shoulder to shoulder. And it's a storytelling that's associated with that becomes part of family life. And that's sort of what the children, what the grown-ups then remember, when, what was their childhood like? Well, we did this. And it's a way of passing on the faith, which is not sort of institutionalized at all, but within the framework of, of a Christian school, which these schools were, church schools.
Yeah, I think in the animation sits where we came to illustrate certain scenes. A lot of the scenes were out in nature, were green, growing, sits out and about. And that came out of the report that, it was walking the dog moments, it's spending time with your child where the questions will come up, where they'll they felt safe. They'll walk along with their parents, and then all of a sudden they'll be thinking, yeah, and then this big question will come up, why does suffering exist? Well, they wouldn't say it that way, but they'll ask something around suffering. Why did the rabbit die? What happens to rabbits when they die? So it's kind of questions. It doesn't always mean making a big shrine in your home and having a big religious corner, and it's creating the space for children to, what was the phrase we use? To be spiritually curious, to keep asking questions, to feel that they're in a safe space, just to ask those big questions without being ridiculed or, oh no, to ask someone else about that. They feel that they're encouraged to wander alongside adults, and I think that can happen in schools, can happen in parishes, because in churches you can have very formal spaces where there is no conversation. Where we move to a child-centric kind of spirituality, how do we create those spaces where we can ask those questions together, whether it's walking a dog in school or out and about with friends and family. So in many ways, the recommendations for the report are really positive, because it's not asking for this massive shift in culture or anything else. It's looking at the small things, the small opportunities of how can we help children grow in their spirituality.
And I think picking up from that, it's not just create, it's being open to, it's being aware. Like some of the parents I spoke to were like, when you're preparing breakfast and suddenly the child asks this really deep question. And it's, the mums would say, but if you engaged then, you need to engage then, because if you leave it and say, we'll talk about that after school, it's gone. And it's being open to those moments when you can engage with the child, when the child's asked that question. And it might be, often it was outside. The children spoke a lot of going on walks, or going to the, they might not have the beach or the forest nearby, but it would be, in the park. I sat on this park bench and we thought, the nature was really important in that space of being outside. Maybe it is that sort of spiritual space. The children don't often speak of spaces in church as being places like that, where they think and reflect like that. It was often outside spaces that they talked about. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to my guests, Kieran and Nick. Next time, we're going to look in a little bit more depth about how we can help children to flourish and to grow resilient spirituality.